A very good afternoon this Monday afternoon. Hope you've had a good day so far. And it is 5:30 and welcome to our next in the series of 7 thoughts of interesting historical characters. I think from what I've listened to and chatted with people over the last few days, that this is perhaps the most controversial character so far. Certainly his name has aroused stronger feelings than C.S. Lewis, shall we say, or J.R. Tolkien or Chesterton or whoever, Corrie ten Boom. Anyway, this one has proved controversial as I've asked people what they think I should say. Oliver Cromwell. A friend, Richard, very kindly emailed me this morning with this, and I'm just going to read this as an introduction. My late father was one of the 6 people, all now dead, who in the late 1950s were present when the head of Oliver Cromwell was finally interred. After Cromwell's embalmed body was exhumed and hung, drawn and quartered at the Restoration, his head, and it remained a head with skin and hair because of the embalming, was impaled above Traitor's Gate and rather forgotten. Many years later, it fell off, still with the impaling spear attached to a length of about a foot, and was taken home by a soldier as a kind of trophy. After passing through various owners, some of whom were known to bring it out and pass it round as a curiosity after dinner, it was finally agreed that it should have a Christian burial. The problem was, where? Parliament didn't want it, and the main anxiety was that extremists, possibly Irishmen because of Cromwell's atrocities in Ireland, would dig it up again. Finally, it was agreed that it would be buried in the Cambridge College where Cromwell had briefly studied. The head was interred in the antechapel, and a plaque says guardedly, "Somewhere near this place is buried." The paving slabs in the antechapel are very large. More lightheartedly, there's a small portrait of the Lord Protector, about a foot square, behind one end of the high table. It is furnished with a small curtain on a drawstring, so that the portrait can be hidden when the loyal toast is drunk. Many thanks to Richard for that. So we noticed that his body had been embalmed when he died in 1658. In fact, he was buried first in Westminster Abbey, but then in 1660, when Charles II returned, his body was exhumed, hung, drawn and quartered 2 years after death, head chopped off and impaled above Traitor's Gate. Was he a traitor or not, etc. And then still, about 300 years later, there's controversy of what do we do with this man's head? Who might react if they can find it? And when the loyal toast is drunk, his face is hidden. I'm not quite sure if that's to spare his blushes or the blushes of those drinking the loyal toast. Oliver Cromwell, born April 1599, Member of Parliament 1628 to 29. And then we have the personal rule of Charles I. Charles I ruled without a parliament between 1629 and 1640. Parliament returns in 1640, and by that stage, lots of the MPs are quite cross and feel their liberties are being taken away in all sorts of directions. Cromwell comes back as an MP for Cambridge, and then in 1642, after 2 years of wrangling between the King and Parliament, the King declares war on Parliament. The King declares war on Parliament, not the other way round. During the Civil War, unexpectedly, Parliament gets stronger militarily, because initially everybody thought that Charles with the Cavaliers would win, and Oliver Cromwell emerges not only as an MP, but as a remarkably successful military commander. Parliament wins the Civil War. 1649, Charles is executed. By that stage, Oliver Cromwell is one of those thinking this king needs to die. He had not thought that earlier. Sometimes people say that Cromwell was against monarchy, that it's a little more complicated than that. He was quite pro-monarchy, especially when it worked well in his eyes. But by 1649, he felt that Charles I needed to go. In 1650, Oliver Cromwell becomes Captain General of the Commonwealth, as England was then called. 1653, Lord Protector. 1657, offered the crown, King Oliver, and he refuses. In 1658, he dies of illness. His son Richard takes over, and It's very clearly not going to work without Oliver Cromwell there. 1660, Charles II comes back and takes the throne. Whatever we think, here was an extraordinary leader who was at the heart of deposing a king, having the king put on trial, seeing the execution through, and then effectively ruling a substantial country in Europe for 8 and a bit years, and doesn't die in battle, dies in bed. He has many thoughts of how he can rule England, and there's the first Protectorate Parliament, second Protectorate Parliament, and there's the rule of the major generals, tries lots of things. None of them quite work, but he is the one in command all the way through. As I say, whatever one thinks of him, he seems to have been an extraordinary leader. As a military general, he was hugely respected and remarkably successful, even when Charles II was back on the throne, when England wasn't doing quite so well in its wars. People very, very quietly were saying this wouldn't have happened if Cromwell had been here. As ever on Monday, we tend to go for quotations to guide us through. I've also been reminded it'd be quite good to see some pictures of what the person looks like. This book by Barry Coward, nice picture of Cromwell there. For those of us who like Ladybird books, there's that one. Many of us have read Antonia Fraser, Cromwell, Our Chief of Men. During the poll, BBC poll, just after 2000, Cromwell ends up in the top 10. But I think in 2003 or 4, a group of MPs wanted to have his statue taken down from outside Parliament. He does arouse strong feelings. 7 thoughts from quotations about him. He was someone who valued the quality of the person higher than the status. And of course, that can be quite challenging in a status-ridden society, as it was in the 17th century. He says this, and he said this to the Earl of Manchester, another parliamentary commander. Cromwell said, I had rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and love what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else. Not so much interested in the outside, interested in the inside. And that phrase, that knows what he fights for and love what he knows, is powerful indeed. He went for the quality of the person. There's a fascinating mix, and maybe this is one of the areas where Cromwell is quite controversial. He said once, I would have been glad to have lived under my woodside and to have kept a flock of sheep rather than to have undertaken this government. He found it incredibly hard to let go of power, but there's quite a bit of him that wished that he didn't have to do it, and that he was just back in Cambridgeshire and farming and peaceful. But the sense of duty seemed to have driven him. There's the famous quote from where we get the phrase, warts of all. People insisted he ought to have his portrait taken. After all, he was ruling England. Mr. Lely, he says, I desire you would use all your skill to paint my picture truly like me, and not flatter me at all, but remark all these roughnesses, pimples, warts, and everything as you see me. Otherwise, I will never pay a farthing for it. How many leaders of nations insist that their portrait painters or their photographers put in all the blemishes? There was one time when he was riding through London and people were cheering, and he was with a companion, and he said, do not trust to the cheering, for those very persons would shout as much if you and I were going to be hanged. He had seemed to have had his feet fairly firmly on the ground, wasn't sure he always enjoyed being in charge, but found it difficult to let go, and didn't really care what he looked like. There was no airbrushing of his pictures. The statue outside the House of Commons in London depicts Cromwell holding a Bible and a sword. It's put up in 1899, so over 200 years after. Lots of discussion in Parliament about whether it should be. But for the moment, let's just note the Bible and the sword. He was a person of a deep faith. He was part of the Puritan tradition. which was very strong in England in the first half, especially of the 17th century. Now, those of us who have pictures in our mind of Puritans looking terribly gloomy and being cross if anybody else is having fun, that's not how they were. And that's part of Charles II post-Restoration propaganda. Cromwell himself enjoyed dancing, music, and going to horse races, and he enjoyed lots of good things. But he was a person of deep faith, loved reading his Bible, quoted his Bible a lot, and the sense of divine duty and calling was with him. Keep your faith in God, but keep your powder dry. And so that practical sense of we need to do what we are called to do. And he said that to his soldiers. There was a moderation here. And here, one of the interesting things about Cromwell is that he held the middle ground. He did something extraordinary. He took over power and got rid of a king and won a war, but he held the middle ground. There were many much more extreme than him. And there was one time when some of the more extreme people wanted to curtail people's liberties because they weren't quite sure that everybody was behaving as they should be. Cromwell says this: "You pretend fear lest error should step in. It's like the man who would keep all wine out of the country lest men should be drunk. It will be found an unjust and unwise jealousy to deprive a man of his natural liberty upon a supposition he may abuse it. When he doth abuse it, judge. So wait for someone to do something wrong before you judge. Do not judge him or her before they do, because they may not do something wrong. It will be found an unjust and unwise jealousy to deprive a man of his natural liberty upon a supposition he may abuse it. When he doth abuse it, judge." In a few moments, we will be coming to Ireland, which I know will be on several people's minds. Just before that, these words about Catholics. Cromwell, like many of his time, found the Catholic Church and Catholicism very difficult. And publicly, he felt that the Mass should not be celebrated. But he said this: "As for the people, what thoughts they have in the matter of religion in their own breasts, I cannot reach. But I shall think it my duty, if they walk honestly and peaceably, not to cause them in the least to suffer for the same." There's a remarkable strain of tolerance there. And what he's saying, in fact, is very similar to what Elizabeth I said, or was attributed to have said: "I will not make windows into men's souls." And certainly that summed up Elizabeth's policy to those whom she didn't agree with religiously, in that as long as they're not causing me trouble, I'm okay with what they may be thinking. Now, we may look around our world today and through history and conscious there are some governments that will seek to punish people for what the governments presume they may be thinking. Cromwell would not go there. If they start to cause upheaval, then that's another thing. But if they're living honestly and peaceably, I'm not going to cause them in the least to suffer for the same. There's an interesting moderation there. On that note, one of the extraordinary things about Cromwell, and unusual, is that he led a revolution and caused that revolution to happen, but then he stopped it before the revolution became hugely bloody and catastrophic. And there were some of his supporters who wanted it to go much further. And Cromwell said, no, we're going to hold it there. And if any of us have the opportunity to look at some of the documents relating to the Putney debates, fascinating, these people, once the king his end was there, and they were discussing what could England begin to look like. And Cromwell is holding the moderate ground, and he was strong enough to keep holding it. If one compares it to the French Revolution, and then to some of the horrors in the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution, etc., it's quite unusual for a revolutionary to be able to take things so far, but then to stop before it gets catastrophic and bloody. I haven't forgotten Ireland. But before that, he was quite an orator and quite tough. And remembering what I said about Cromwell's quote that he'd rather be at home by his woodside and tending his flocks, he couldn't quite let go if the protective parliaments failed to do what he thought that they should do. This was the speech he made in 1653 to the end of the Long Parliament. He felt that he had had enough. It is high time for me to put an end to your sitting in this place. That's quite interesting. Cromwell feels it is up to him to do this. It is high time for me to put an end to your sitting in this place, which you have dishonored by your contempt of all virtue and defiled by your practice of every vice. You are a factious crew and enemies to all good government. Ye are a pack of mercenary wretches and would like Esau sell your country for a mess of pottage and like Judas betray your God for a few pieces of money. We note the biblical allusions. Is there a single virtue now remaining amongst you? Is there one vice you do not possess? You have no more religion than my horse. Gold is your God. Which of you have not bartered your conscience for bribes? Is there a man amongst you that has the least care for the good of the Commonwealth? You can imagine Cromwell walking up and down and the MPs sitting round thinking, we can probably guess where this is going. Ye sordid prostitutes, have you not defiled this sacred place and turned the Lord's temple into a den of thieves by your immoral principles and wicked practices? You are grown intolerably odious to the whole nation. You are deputed here by the people to get grievances redressed. Are yourselves gone? So take away that shining bauble there and lock up the doors. In the name of God, go. And the soldiers came in and they went. The army always supported Cromwell. Two reasons. First of all, he kept winning battles and soldiers understandably always admire that. Secondly, he seemed to have had very strong personal relationships. There was affection there. He does seem to have been inspiring as well as successful. And of course, the two go together. It's understandably and rightly be said that this was really just a military dictatorship. And there's an element of truth in that, lots of elements of truth in that. But Cromwell still seemed to be doing the best he could for his country. He longed for parliamentary government to work. Let's go to Ireland. Cromwell went to Ireland to see if he could conquer it. And during that time, in two particular places, Drogheda and Wexford, there was massacre of civilians after the towns were taken. Now, there is some historical controversy about that. And certainly when Charles II came to the throne, there was lots of attempts, understandably, Oliver Cromwell had killed his father, lots of attempts by Charles II's government to say that Cromwell had been terribly evil all the way through. Cromwell himself seemed to have been mixed up and unsure and realized that it hadn't gone well. I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches who have imbrued their hands in so much innocent blood, and that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood for the future, which are satisfactory grounds for such actions, which otherwise cannot but work remorse and regret. And the implication is there was remorse and regret, and he's trying to do perhaps a little bit of post-justification. Maybe it will persuade the other towns to surrender rather than fight to the end. There's also a possibility that some of the soldiers, which is unusual for Cromwell, slightly lost control, because Cromwell had said, I do hereby warn all officers, soldiers and others under my command not to do any wrong or violence toward country people or any persons whatsoever, unless they be actually in arms or office with the enemy, as they shall answer to the contrary at their utmost peril. Now, he had said that in Ireland, and so he had said normal war rules apply, that if people don't surrender, then we will only punish soldiers, not civilians. But somehow it did go terribly wrong, and understandably in Ireland, that's remembered. There's also the controversial, difficult thing. He did it in Ireland, or it happened in Ireland, but such a thing never really happened in England. How do we cope with someone with such a stain on their reputation? How do we cope with the stains on our reputation, albeit not as serious, I guess, as this? And it is one of the key reasons why Cromwell brings such strong emotions. So much he did was remarkable in its achievement. I was talking to someone this afternoon, no fan of Cromwell, but who said, well, because of Cromwell, we had the real establishment of Parliament as a strength in this land. Very possible without Cromwell, we wouldn't have had, this is me talking now, not my friend, wouldn't have had the 1688 glorious revolution when Parliament again asserted themselves. So he seemed to have played a great role in the growth of parliamentary democracy. But there is this big stain on his reputation. How do we cope with the mixed messages we get from him and indeed from everybody? Point 7, conscious of the time. I'm being a bit longer today, forgive me. Oliver Cromwell, I said earlier that he was very religious, a Puritan. He saw the hand of God in what happened. And one of the things Oliver Cromwell wrestled with, and this is really why he didn't return to his flocks and his woodside, is he kept winning battles, and often quite unexpectedly. After the Battle of Dunbar on the 3rd of September 1650, 3rd of September, big day for Cromwell, he won the Battle of Worcester the next year on 3rd of September, and he died on the 3rd of September 1658. Anyway, after the Battle of Dunbar, he said this: "A high act of the Lord's providence to us, and one of his most signal mercies God hath done for England and his people." Oliver Cromwell felt as long as he was successful, this was a sign that God was at work in his life. And I think that brings a very interesting discussion. Is that how we see the guidance of God? Is it purely when we are successful? Does that mean God's at work? But perhaps God also is at work when we fail and when we mess things up and when things don't go well. But Oliver Cromwell's career was so extraordinary and so unexpected that he felt God must be guiding me here, directing me. I must do the best for my country. Like with all these characters on a Monday afternoon, it raises interesting and big questions, how we see people, how we see ourselves, and what motivates people. This afternoon, we have noted that he was interested in quality, not status, that he had this sense of perspective, wasn't bothered how people thought he looked, and would really quite like to be at home having a quiet life. That sense of faith and the practical, keep your faith in God, but keep your powder dry. That moderation about that we stay clear of unnecessary laws, and also we don't mind too much what people think, as long as they're not doing active harm. His toughness with Parliament and others if he disagreed, and he was really quite a good orator. He made speeches well. Maybe that was part of his inspiration there. The stain on his reputation, Ireland, and he was someone who saw the hand of God at work in what he did. He was deeply sad that he couldn't establish effective, in his eyes, parliamentary government during the Protectorate. He did refuse to have the crown. He felt that would just make no sense after all he had fought for. An interesting character indeed, someone very much part of the history in these islands. Thank you so much for listening this afternoon. And as always, if you wish to find more, that's really the point of these little sessions, then let's go and read and watch and see what we can find. Thank you so much.